Something was buried in the frozen ground of Minnesota that was never supposed to be found. Not by a farmer, not by accident, and certainly not in 1898, nearly 6 centuries after it was supposedly left there. A 200-pound stone slab, covered in ancient symbols, pulled from the roots of a tree by a man who could barely read the language carved into it. The academics laughed, the historians dismissed it, the government ignored it, but the stone kept surviving every attempt to bury it again, this time in silence. Here is what they have never fully told you. There are moments in history when a single discovery does not just add a new chapter to the past, it threatens to rewrite the entire book. What happened on a rural farm in western Minnesota in the autumn of 1898 was exactly that kind of moment. And yet, over a century later, most people still do not know the full story. They have been given fragments. They have been handed conclusions without the journey. And the journey, as it turns out, is the most important part of all. Olof Åman was not looking for history that morning. He was a Swedish immigrant, a farmer by trade, a man of calloused hands and quiet ambitions. He had come to Douglas County, Minnesota, in 1879, part of a wave of Scandinavian immigrants who flooded the American Midwest in the late 19th century, drawn by cheap land and the promise of a new beginning. On a particular autumn day in 1898, he and his young son Edward were doing what frontier farmers did, clearing land, removing stumps, tearing roots from the frozen Minnesota earth to make room for crops. It was hard, unremarkable work, until it wasn't. Beneath the roots of an aspen tree, something resisted, something heavy, something that did not belong there. When they finally pulled it free, what they held in their hands was a 202-pound slab of gray sandstone, a type of rock geologists would later identify as greywacke, measuring roughly 30 by 16 inches. The front face and one side were covered in markings, symbols carved into the stone with a precision and confidence that immediately told anyone who looked at it, this was not an accident. This was not nature. Someone had deliberately placed a message here. Someone had wanted it to survive. Think about what that means for a moment. A message, left in the ground, in Minnesota, in the 14th century, that is the claim. And it is a claim that has shaken scholars, divided historians, provoked accusations of fraud, and ignited one of the longest-running archaeological controversies in American history. Åman brought the stone to the nearest town, Kensington, where it was placed on display in the local bank. A rough copy of the inscriptions was sent to the University of Minnesota, where a Scandinavian languages professor named Olaus J. Breda attempted a translation. What he found carved into that rock was not gibberish. It was not random scratching. No, it was language, Old Norse runic script mixed with medieval Swedish phrasing. And when the words were finally decoded, they described something so extraordinary that the academic establishment did not know whether to be astonished or suspicious. The translation reads as follows. We are 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey from Vinland through the west. We had camped by a lake with 2 skerries, 1 day's journey north from this stone. We were out fishing one day. After we came home, we found 10 of our men red with blood and dead. AVM, save us from evil. We have 10 men by the sea to look after our ships. 14 days' journey from this island. Year 1362. Read that again, slowly. 10 men found red with blood and dead. A plea to God. A note about ships sitting 14 days' journey away. And a date, 1362. If the inscription is authentic, then Norse explorers were standing in what is now the state of Minnesota more than 130 years before Christopher Columbus completed his first transatlantic voyage. They were not on the coast of Newfoundland, where we already know the Vikings had been. They were deep inside the American continent, in a place no European was supposed to reach for centuries. They were there, and they were dying there. And they left a message in stone because they knew the world needed to know. But here is where it gets complicated. The academic response was not wonder. It was skepticism. Immediate, overwhelming, and in many cases, brutally dismissive. Professor Breda himself called it a forgery within days of examining the inscription. The language was wrong, he argued. The runes were wrong. The syntax was wrong. Several Scandinavian runologists in Europe agreed. The stone, they said, could not possibly be from 1362 because it used runes and grammatical structures that did not exist in the 14th century. Case closed. Investigation over. Move on. Except the stone did not move on. It refused to disappear quietly. And the people who continued to study it kept finding things that the official dismissal had never bothered to explain. Here's the first thing that bothers serious researchers about the hoax theory. The man accused of creating this forgery, Olof Åman, was a relatively uneducated Swedish farmer. He was not a linguist. He was not a historian. He was not a runologist. He owned a small personal library, which skeptics point to as potential source material, but the library he owned contained none of the obscure medieval rune charts that would have been necessary to reproduce what is carved on that stone. And what's more, Åman never attempted to profit from the discovery. He never sold the stone for personal gain. He never traveled to lecture halls or newspapers to champion his own discovery. He suffered years of ridicule and family hardship because of the attention the stone brought him, and he maintained until his death that what he found was real. People who perpetrate elaborate hoaxes for fame and money do not typically respond to their own invention by suffering in silence for decades. And then there's the question of the runes themselves. This is where the story truly shifts. For years, the most powerful argument against the stone's authenticity was the presence of what linguists called the dotted R, a specific runic character found on the Kensington stone that experts insisted simply did not exist in 14th century Scandinavian writing. It was invented, they said. It was a rookie mistake by a forger who did not know his medieval alphabet well enough. It was proof the stone was a 19th century fake. This argument was treated as definitive. For decades, it effectively ended the debate before it could properly begin. Then, in 2004, researchers discovered that same dotted R in a verified medieval document dating to 1329, found on the Swedish island of Gotland, a legitimate, authenticated, pre-existing medieval document, using the exact same runic character that experts had declared impossible. Suddenly, the invented rune was not invented at all. Suddenly, the supposedly impossible symbol had a paper trail. Suddenly, one of the most important arguments against the stone's authenticity collapsed entirely. The academics who had used the dotted R as their smoking gun evidence largely went quiet. The stone, however, kept talking. This is where everything changes. In the early 2000s, the Runestone Museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, where the stone had been on display for decades, commissioned a forensic geological analysis. They hired Scott Wolter, president of American Petrographic Services in St. Paul, a man with no personal stake in the outcome, just a geologist asked to read the story the rock itself was telling. What Wolter found when he examined the microscopic structure of the inscription grooves was not what the hoax theorists predicted. He conducted a detailed petrographic analysis, studying the crystalline structure of the stone at a microscopic level, and what he found in the walls of the carved rune grooves was evidence of significant weathering, not surface weathering, not cosmetic aging, deep structural weathering of the mica crystals embedded in the greywacke itself. Wolter concluded that the inscriptions were, at minimum, more than 200 years old. In his professional assessment, a 19th century forger working in 1898 could not have replicated that level of geological aging. The breakdown of mica crystals in groove walls takes centuries, not decades. His conclusion was blunt. This stone is not a modern forgery. It must be accepted as a genuine record of exploration at the date stated in the inscription. Now, that conclusion remains contested. Other geologists have pushed back. The debate has not ended. But here's the critical point that most mainstream coverage consistently ignores. A professional forensic geologist, using modern analytical techniques, examined this stone and said it was real. That is not a fringe opinion held by folklore enthusiasts in a small-town museum. That is a trained scientist delivering a professional finding based on physical evidence. The fact that this finding has been marginalized rather than rigorously re-examined tells its own uncomfortable story about how the academic establishment sometimes treats evidence that does not fit the preferred conclusion. But the stone is only one piece of this. Because what makes the Kensington Runestone genuinely extraordinary is not just the stone itself. It is everything that surrounds it. It is the wider pattern of evidence that has been accumulating quietly, piece by piece, for over a century. Evidence that mainstream archaeology has never quite managed to fully dismiss, no matter how hard it has tried. According to investigators who have followed the physical geography of the region, what appears to be 5 possible Viking campsites have been identified along a 750-mile corridor, stretching from Hudson Bay southward toward Sauk Center in central Minnesota. Along this corridor, triangular holes have been found drilled into lakeside boulders, holes that bear a striking resemblance to the mooring stones used by Norse seafarers to anchor their boats in shallow water. These are not random geological formations. They are carved, they are precise, and they appear at intervals along a route that would make geographic sense for a party of 30 men navigating from the coast of Hudson Bay into the interior of the North American continent by river and portage. Investigators who have traced the route described in the stone's inscription have found that it is not geographically impossible, it is geographically coherent. A party traveling south from Hudson Bay, following river systems, carrying canoes and supplies, could reach the area near modern-day Alexandria, Minnesota, in a journey that aligns with the 14 days referenced in the inscription. The math works, the geography works, the landscape fits. And there is more. Near the banks of the Red River near Climax, Minnesota, north of where the stone was found, an old fire stele of distinctly medieval Norse design was recovered from deep below the riverbank. That artifact, added to the medieval Norse specimen collection at the Oslo University Museum, predates the discovery of the Kensington stone by 27 years. Nobody planted it to support a hoax. Nobody knew the stone would surface a generation later. It was simply there, in the ground, waiting. What most people are not seeing is the cumulative weight of this evidence. Each individual artifact or site can be dismissed in isolation. A mooring hole here, a fire steel there, a runestone in someone's field. Alone, none of it is conclusive. But when you step back and look at the full pattern, the geographic corridor, the campsite markers, the water route logic, the Norse tools, the geologically aged stone, the inscription that uses a runic character later proven to be historically accurate, you are no longer looking at a hoax. You are looking at a trail, and trails lead somewhere. The inscription itself has something else to say that deserves far more attention than it has ever received. When scholars initially dismissed the stone, they focused on the language. What they largely ignored was the tone, the emotional register of the message. Because if you read it carefully, not as a linguist cataloging grammatical structures, but as a human being reading a message written by other human beings in a moment of crisis, it sounds nothing like a hoax. It sounds like grief. It sounds like fear. 10 men found covered in blood. A prayer carved into stone. A note about the ships left behind, as if someone was desperately trying to record information for whoever might eventually find the message and come looking. Hoaxes are written to impress. This inscription was written to survive. There is a difference, and it is not subtle. According to informed sources within the archaeological community, the Kensington debate has never truly closed. It has merely been managed. The academic establishment made a decision early in the 20th century that the stone was a hoax, and that decision calcified into consensus through repetition rather than through exhaustive re-examination. Journals that published skeptical analyses received follow-up studies and letters pointing out errors or omissions, but those responses rarely received the same institutional prominence as the original dismissals. The stone went to the Smithsonian Institution in 1948 and was displayed there for an entire year. A museum official named M.W. Sterling, quoted in a September 1948 issue of National Geographic, called it probably the most important archaeological object yet found in North America. And then, somehow, it ended up back in a small museum in Alexandria, Minnesota, where it still sits today, behind glass, surrounded by dioramas, waiting for the serious investigation it has never truly received. This is not a story about a stone. This is a story about what happens when a discovery challenges the official version of history, and the official version of history fights back. The Vikings were not supposed to be in Minnesota. The textbook story of European contact with the American interior begins with the Spanish, the French, the British, navigators and conquistadors arriving by established routes, moving westward through recognized passages. The idea of Norse explorers standing beside a Minnesota lake in 1362, carving a prayer into rock after watching their companions die, shatters that linear narrative. It suggests that the story of European contact with North America is messier, earlier, and far more complicated than the approved version allows. And messier histories are harder to teach, harder to manage, and far more threatening to the clean timelines that institutions prefer. Here is what we know without any serious dispute. The Vikings were in North America. That is no longer controversial. The settlement at Lens aux Meadows in Newfoundland, discovered in 1960 by Norwegian archaeologists Helge and Anne Ingstad, is a confirmed, authenticated Norse settlement dating to approximately 1000 AD. Norse sagas had been describing a land beyond Greenland called Vinland for centuries, and Lens aux Meadows provided the hard proof. The Vikings were here. They had the vessels to navigate the Atlantic. They had the navigational knowledge to reach the coast. What remains officially contested is how far they went. The mainstream position says they stayed near the coast. But here's the question nobody is comfortably answering. If they had the technology to cross the Atlantic Ocean, what exactly would have stopped them from following a river inland? Norse longships and knarrs were remarkably adaptable vessels, capable of navigating in as little as 1 meter of water. The Viking Age of exploration was not characterized by timidity. These were people who had settled Iceland, colonized Greenland, and reached North America 500 years before Columbus was born. The idea that they reached Newfoundland and then simply turned around, that they looked at the mouth of the St. Lawrence River and decided not to explore further, requires a certain willful incuriosity that does not match the historical character of Norse exploration at all. What we know about Vikings is that they pushed. They went further. They always went further. The 1362 date on the stone is also strategically important. It places the supposed expedition not in the Viking Age proper, not in the era of Leif Erikson and the Vinland sagas, but in the medieval period, 3.5 centuries later. By 1362, the Norse Greenland colonies had been established for nearly 400 years. Viking descendants were still sailing the North Atlantic. The Knights Templar had been dissolved 50 years earlier, scattering trained warrior navigators with maritime expertise across Europe and Scandinavia. Geologist Scott Wolter has suggested, controversially, that the 30 men on the Kensington expedition may have been connected to this tradition. that the inscription is not merely a record of exploration, but a legal claim of territorial acquisition made by men who understood what they were doing at a geopolitical level. That theory remains hotly debated. But the broader point stands. 1362 is not an impossible date for European explorers to have reached the interior of North America via Hudson Bay. It is an uncomfortable date. Those are not the same thing. What is also rarely discussed is the human element hidden inside the inscription's final lines. AVM, save us from evil. This is a Latin prayer. It stands for Ave Virgo Maria, Hail, Virgin Mary. Medieval Catholics used it in moments of genuine fear. It is not the kind of phrase a forger stitches into a runic inscription to make it look authentic. It is not the kind of detail a Swedish farmer in 1898 would spontaneously invent to make a fake stone more convincing. It is the kind of phrase a terrified man carves into rock when he has just found 10 of his companions murdered and he does not know if he is next. That inscription contains the sound of human terror, and it has been analyzed and debated almost entirely in the abstract, as a linguistic curiosity rather than as evidence of a real event witnessed by real people in real fear. 10 men red with blood and dead. Think about what that actually means. 30 people traveled into the interior of an unknown continent. They split into groups. Some went fishing. Some stayed at camp. When the fishing party returned, they found 10 of their companions killed. In a place where no European was supposed to be. Among people, almost certainly indigenous peoples of the Minnesota region, who had their own reasons for responding violently to armed strangers appearing on their territory. The Kensington inscription does not describe conquest. It describes disaster. It describes what happens when a small group of European explorers pushes too far into territory they do not understand, loses men they cannot replace, and scratches a desperate record of their own disintegration into the hardest surface they can find. That is not a hoax, that is history. And yet the mooring stones remain unstudied. The fire steel from the Red River remains a footnote. The dotted R vindication of 2004 received a fraction of the coverage that the original dismissals had received. Geologist Wolter's petrographic findings were published and then largely buried under the weight of the pre-existing consensus. The stone sits in its glass case in Alexandria, Minnesota, precisely 202 pounds of unresolved possibility, visited annually by tourists who read the placard and move on without fully grasping what they are standing in front of. What most people are not seeing is that the Kensington Runestone controversy is not actually a debate about one artifact. It is a debate about authority. It is a debate about who gets to decide what is real in American history, who gets to revise the official record, and how much evidence it takes to overturn a conclusion that institutional academia made more than a century ago. The standard of proof demanded from those who support the stone's authenticity has always been far higher than the standard of proof accepted by those who dismiss it. Dismissal requires only doubt. Authentication requires certainty. And in a field where the physical evidence has been decaying in the Minnesota soil for 600 years, certainty is nearly impossible to achieve. That asymmetry is not an accident. It is a structural feature of how contested history is managed. The Mandan people of the northern Great Plains have long presented another layer of this mystery. European explorers who reached the Mandan villages in the 18th century reported something deeply unusual. Among this indigenous nation, there were individuals with blue or gray eyes and lighter hair, physical characteristics that fell outside what European observers expected from a population that had no known prior contact with Europe. Some Mandan ceremonial practices showed structural similarities to European Christian traditions that researchers found difficult to explain through independent development. The Mandan themselves had oral traditions describing pale-skinned visitors from long ago. These observations have been overinterpreted and misused in the past, often in ways that were deeply racist and historically irresponsible. But the raw fact of those early European accounts remains, and it sits uncomfortably close to the geography of the Kensington inscription and to the timeline of 1362. What happened in that corridor between Hudson Bay and Minnesota in the medieval period is a question that has not been answered. It has only been avoided. Here's where the story now stands in the clearest possible terms. The stone exists. It has been examined by forensic geologists, runologists, historians, and linguists for over 120 years. No one has produced definitive, universally accepted proof that it is a fake. No one has produced a convincing candidate for who forged it, with what tools, with what knowledge, and to what purpose. Olaf Oman is the only serious suspect the hoax theory has ever offered, and the case against him depends on assuming he had knowledge and capabilities that his entire documented life suggests he did not have. Meanwhile, the physical evidence of the stone's age, the geological weathering, the verified medieval rune characters, the geographic coherence of the route described, continues to accumulate in the direction of authenticity, piece by piece, study by study, year by year. The stone that was pulled from beneath the roots of an aspen tree in the autumn of 1898 is still waiting. It has survived dismissal, ridicule, institutional suppression, and more than a century of determined skepticism. It has outlasted everyone who tried to explain it away. And the questions it raises, about how far the Norse explorers traveled, about who was in the interior of North America before the arrival of Columbus, about what European contact with the Americas really looked like in the medieval period, those questions are not getting smaller, they are getting larger. Every new piece of evidence adds weight to a scale that was supposed to have been settled long ago. What we know about history is always only a fraction of what actually happened. The past does not announce itself. It does not send formal documentation. It buries its evidence in riverbanks and tree roots and stone, and it waits for someone to ask the right questions with enough courage to accept whatever the answers turn out to be. Olaf Ullmann asked a question in 1898 simply by pulling a heavy stone out of the frozen Minnesota ground. The question has never been fully answered. And somewhere beneath the prairies of the American Midwest, there may be more stones, more fire steels, more triangular holes drilled into lakeside boulders by hands that crossed an ocean and then kept going. More evidence of a presence that the official history of this continent has spent over a century learning not to see. The men who carved that message in 1362, if they were real, died in a land they never understood, fighting a threat they never anticipated, leaving behind a record that may never be fully accepted. But they carved it anyway. They cut their words into the hardest stone they could find, and they buried it deep enough that it would survive. Not for their generation, not for the academics of the 19th century who dismissed it without fully reading it. For whoever, someday, would finally have the patience and the courage to sit with the evidence and let it speak. That stone has been speaking for over 100 years. The real question is not whether the Vikings were in Minnesota. The real question is why we are still so afraid to listen.